The clock on the wall read 11:40 at night, when Elena Marsh's hand froze above the drawer of the study desk. Her heart began to pound so hard she could hear it in her own ears. The house was silent, except for the soft ticking of that clock, and the wind pressing against the tall windows. She had come into the Duke's private study, only to collect a forgotten coffee cup, nothing more. But the drawer had been left half open, and inside it sat a thick envelope, torn slightly at the corner, spilling out more money than she had ever seen in her life. She stood completely still. Her fingers trembled as she reached out, not to take it, but simply to push the drawer closed and pretend she had seen nothing. But her eyes betrayed her. She could not look away from the stacks of crisp bills bound with paper strips, each one representing an amount that could change everything about her life in a single night. Elena had worked in the Ashford estate for almost 3 years. She knew every creak of the wooden floors, every hallway that led to the kitchens, every room where dust liked to settle no matter how many times she cleaned it. She knew the schedule of the household staff, the hours when the guards changed shifts, and the exact moment when the great iron gates outside were locked for the night. She knew this house better than she knew her own small apartment across town, and in 3 years, she had never once taken anything that was not hers, not even a stray coin left on a table. But tonight was different. Tonight, staring at that envelope, her mind was pulled in every direction at once. She thought of her brother Daniel lying in a hospital bed 2 miles away, his breathing shallow, his face pale against the white pillow. She thought of the doctor's voice from 2 days ago, calm but firm, saying that without the surgery soon, his condition would only get worse. She thought of the folder of medical bills sitting on her kitchen table, growing thicker with each passing week, bills she had no way of paying. Her hand hovered over the envelope again. She could hear her own breath now, shallow and fast. No one knew she was still in the house. The Duke, Nathaniel Ashford, had left that afternoon for an emergency business trip, and most of the staff had already gone home for the night. Only a night guard remained near the front gate, likely half asleep in his chair by now. It would be so simple. She could take the envelope, slip it into her coat, walk out through the side door she used every night, and no one would ever know it was her. She had never imagined herself as someone capable of such a thing. She had always believed, quietly and firmly, that honesty was not something you practiced only when it was easy. It was something you held on to especially when it was hard, especially when no one was watching. But that belief had never truly been tested before. Not like this. Not with her brother's life weighed against it. She picked up the envelope. The moment her fingers touched the paper, doubt flooded through her chest like ice water. What was she doing? She was a housekeeper, not a thief. She set the envelope back down, then picked it up again, then set it down once more, her thoughts spinning in circles that led nowhere. Somewhere outside, a car passed on the distant road, and the sound of its engine made her jump, her whole body tensing as though she had already been caught. She reminded herself to breathe. She closed her eyes and pictured Daniel's face when he was younger, before either of their parents had passed, back when their biggest worry was who would win at cards after dinner. He had always looked up to her, ever since they were children. He trusted her completely. If she did this, if she took money that was never meant for her, what kind of example would that be? And yet, if she did nothing, if she left this room and this money untouched, would she be able to live with watching him grow sicker, knowing she had walked past the very thing that could have saved him? The study around her felt suddenly larger, the shadows deeper. Portraits of Ashford ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to watch her every movement. She had always found this room slightly intimidating, filled as it was with leather-bound books, polished wood, and the quiet authority that came from generations of wealth. Now it felt like a trap, a test she had never asked to take. She thought about walking away entirely, pretending she had seen nothing, letting the drawer remain as it was, and finishing her work as though this moment had never happened. But some part of her knew that ignoring it would not make the temptation disappear. It would only follow her home, sit with her at the kitchen table, and whisper to her every time she looked at Daniel's bills. Footsteps sounded somewhere down the hallway, faint but unmistakable. Elena's whole body went rigid. She quickly closed the drawer, though not all the way, her fingers slipping slightly in her hurry. She turned toward the study door, her breath caught in her throat, waiting to see who would appear. The footsteps grew louder, then paused, then faded again, as whoever it was turned down a different corridor. It was probably just another staff member finishing their rounds, but the fear that had gripped her in that moment was enough to shake her fully back to reality. She realized, standing there with her heart still racing, that she could not make this decision in a rush, in fear, in the middle of the night with her nerves stretched thin. She needed to finish her work, go home, and think clearly. She picked up the forgotten coffee cup from the side table, the very reason she had come into the room in the first place, and walked toward the door. Just before leaving, she glanced back one more time at the drawer, now closed, but not fully shut, hiding its secret inside. The walk to the side exit felt longer than usual. Every sound in the quiet house seemed magnified, every shadow more suspicious. She passed the kitchen, where the last light had already been turned off, and stepped out into the cool night air. The estate grounds stretched wide and dark around her, the distant streetlights barely reaching past the iron fence. She pulled her coat tighter and began her walk toward the bus stop, her mind still spinning with everything she had just seen. As she walked, she thought about the years she had spent working in that house. She remembered her first week, when she had been so nervous about breaking something valuable that she barely touched anything, unless she absolutely had to. She remembered the head housekeeper, a stern but kind woman who had once told her that trust, once broken, could never be fully repaired, no matter how many apologies followed. Those words had stayed with her ever since, quietly guiding the way she handled every task, every responsibility placed in her care. She thought too about Nathaniel Ashford himself, a man she had spoken to only a handful of times in 3 years, mostly polite greetings passed in hallways, or brief instructions about which rooms needed attention. He was known throughout the staff as fair but distant, someone who ran his household with quiet efficiency and rarely raised his voice. She had heard rumors, of course, about his wealth, his family's long history, and the responsibilities that came with managing such a large estate, but she had never imagined herself standing this close to a decision that involved him so directly. By the time she reached the bus stop, her hands had stopped shaking, but her mind had not settled. She sat on the cold metal bench, watching the empty street, and allowed herself to imagine, just for a moment, what her life could look like with that kind of money. Daniel's surgery paid for without worry. The eviction notice taped to her apartment door finally torn down and forgotten. A future where she was not calculating every dollar, every hour of overtime, every possible way to stretch what little she had. But even as she imagined it, a heaviness settled in her chest. It was not the kind of future she wanted to build on something taken in secret, something that would sit inside her like a stone for the rest of her life. She had always believed that the things worth having were the things earned honestly, even if that path was harder and slower. She thought of her mother, who had raised her and Daniel with almost nothing, yet had never once allowed either of them to take something that was not theirs, not even in the hardest years. The bus arrived, its headlights cutting through the darkness, and Elena stepped on, taking a seat near the back window. As the vehicle pulled away from the estate, she watched the great house grow smaller behind her, its windows dark, except for a single light left on somewhere near the upper floor. She did not know, sitting there in that quiet bus with the city lights blurring past, that the decision she was about to make in the coming hours would change far more than just her own life. She only knew that the money sitting in that drawer had already begun to feel less like an opportunity and more like a weight she could not carry, no matter how desperately she needed the relief it promised. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. It was a message from the hospital, a routine update about Daniel's condition, stable for now but requiring close monitoring. She read the words twice, her thumb hovering over the screen, and felt the pull of temptation return, stronger this time, mixed with something close to desperation. She closed her eyes and leaned her head against the cool glass of the bus window, letting the hum of the engine fill the silence in her mind. She did not have an answer yet. Not really, but somewhere beneath the fear and the exhaustion and the desperate love she carried for her brother, a quieter voice was beginning to speak, one that reminded her who she had always tried to be. Whether she would listen to that voice, or let need overpower it, was a question she would have to answer before the night was over. The bus rolled on through the empty streets, carrying her toward home, toward Daniel's empty bed in their apartment, toward the folder of bills waiting on the kitchen table, and somewhere behind her, in a dark and silent study, an envelope sat in a half-open drawer, holding inside it a decision that would test everything Elena Marsh believed about herself. By the time she reached her stop, Her chest felt tight with the weight of a choice she had not yet made. She walked the short distance to her apartment building, climbed the narrow stairs to the second floor, and let herself into the quiet space she and Daniel called home. The silence there felt different from the silence of the estate, heavier somehow, filled with worry rather than grandeur. She sat down at the kitchen table, the folder of bills right where she had left it that morning, and stared at it for a long time without opening it. Tomorrow, she would have to make a decision. Tonight, all she could do was sit with the weight of it, letting the hours pass slowly around her, the city outside growing quieter as the night deepened into its final, still hours before dawn. Morning came with a gray light pressing through the thin curtains of Elena's apartment, and she woke to find she had barely slept at all. Her body ached from the tension she had carried through the night, and her mind felt heavy, as though she had spent the hours arguing with herself in her dreams. She sat up slowly, rubbing her eyes, and glanced at the folder of bills still sitting on the kitchen table where she had left it, untouched and unopened. She made herself a cup of tea, more out of habit than desire, and sat down to finally open the folder. The numbers inside were no kinder in daylight than they had been the night before. The hospital had sent an updated estimate for Daniel's surgery, and the figure at the bottom of the page made her stomach tighten. It was more than she earned in an entire year, even with every hour of overtime she could manage. Beneath the medical papers sat another letter, one she had been avoiding for days, from her landlord. The eviction notice was clear and final. If she could not pay the overdue rent within 2 weeks, she and Daniel would lose their home. She pressed her palms against her eyes and took a long breath. It had not always been this hard. When their parents were alive, life had been simple, filled with small comforts that she had not appreciated fully until they were gone. Their mother had worked as a seamstress, their father as a mechanic, and though money had never been abundant, it had always been enough. When both parents passed within a year of each other, first their father from a sudden illness, and then their mother from what the doctors quietly called a broken heart, Elena had been only 19. She had taken on the role of caretaker for Daniel, who was just 14 at the time, without a single moment of hesitation. She thought back to those early years often, especially on nights like the one before. She remembered working 2 jobs at once, cleaning offices in the early morning, before school let out, and waiting tables in the evenings, just to keep their small apartment and make sure Daniel never went without a meal. She remembered the pride she felt when he graduated high school and the fear that gripped her when, a year later, he began showing signs of the illness that would eventually change both their lives. The doctors had explained it many times over the years, using words that Elena had grown to understand almost as well as they did. Daniel's heart had a defect, one that had gone unnoticed in his younger years, but had grown more serious with time. Surgery was the only real solution, a procedure complicated and expensive, one that required a specialist and a hospital equipped for such delicate work. Every year, the doctors had said the same thing: watch it closely. Manage the symptoms. Wait for the right moment when surgery becomes necessary rather than optional. That moment, according to the doctor's most recent message, had finally arrived. Elena closed the folder and pressed her hands flat against the table, trying to steady the tremor she felt building inside her chest. She thought of her job at the Ashford estate, the only stable income she had, and how carefully she had built her reputation there over 3 years. She had started as a temporary cleaner, barely more than a trial hire brought in during a busy season, and had worked her way into becoming one of the most trusted members of the household staff. She was the one asked to handle delicate tasks, the one given keys to rooms others were not permitted to enter, the one the head housekeeper relied upon when guests of importance visited the estate. She thought of Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper who had trained her from her very first day. Mrs. Whitfield was a woman in her 60s, sharp-eyed and quick-witted, who ran the household staff with a mixture of firmness and genuine care. She had taken a liking to Elena early on, recognizing in her a quiet determination that reminded her, she once said, of herself at that age. Over the years, Mrs. Whitfield had become something close to family, offering advice not just about work but about life, about carrying burdens with grace, even when they felt unbearable. It was Mrs. Whitfield who had first introduced Elena to another member of the staff, a young woman named Grace who worked in the kitchens. Grace was a few years younger than Elena, warm and quick to laugh, but carrying her own quiet struggles beneath her cheerful exterior. The two women had grown close over shared lunch breaks and late evenings finishing tasks together, bonding over the particular loneliness that came from working long hours, in service to a household that was not their own. Elena thought of Grace now, sitting at her kitchen table with the weight of the previous night still pressing on her chest. A few months earlier, Grace had come to her in tears, explaining that her younger sister's family had lost their home in a fire and needed help rebuilding their lives. Grace, unable to cover the costs alone on her modest kitchen wages, had confided in Elena out of desperation rather than any expectation of help. Elena, without much thought at the time, had begun quietly setting aside a portion of her own paycheck each month to help Grace's sister get back on her feet, never mentioning it to anyone else on the staff, not even Mrs. Whitfield. It had not been a large sum, not compared to what sat in that envelope in the Duke's study, but it had been enough to strain Elena's already thin budget. She had told herself at the time that it was simply the right thing to do, that Grace would have done the same for her, and that some things mattered more than personal comfort. She had not considered, in the months since, how much that quiet sacrifice had added to her own financial struggles, layering on top of Daniel's mounting medical bills and the ever-present threat of losing their apartment. Now, staring at the folder on her table, Elena wondered if she had been foolish to give away money she could barely spare in the first place. But even as the thought crossed her mind, she knew she would make the same choice again if given the chance. Grace's sister had 2 small children, and the fire had left them with nothing. Elena remembered the fear in Grace's voice, so similar to the fear she herself carried for Daniel, and she understood, in a way few others could, what it meant to watch someone you loved suffer while feeling powerless to help. She thought about the envelope again, the stacks of money sitting in that drawer, untouched since the moment she had closed it the night before. It would solve everything at once. Daniel's surgery, the rent, perhaps even enough left over to help Grace's sister more fully, to ease every burden weighing on the people she cared about. The temptation was not simply about herself anymore. It was about everyone she loved, all of them struggling in their own ways, all of them relying on her in some fashion to hold things together. She stood from the table and walked to the small window overlooking the street below. The city was waking up, cars beginning to move along the road, a few early risers walking briskly toward their jobs. She thought about how easy it would be to simply not go back to work that day, to call in sick, to give herself time to think without the pressure of walking through those familiar halls again. But she knew avoidance would not solve anything. The money was still there, waiting, and eventually, she would have to decide what to do about it. Her phone rang, startling her from her thoughts. It was the hospital again, this time with a nurse on the line rather than an automated message. The nurse's voice was calm, but carried an edge of urgency that made Elena's chest tighten instantly. Daniel had experienced a difficult night, his heart rate spiking unexpectedly, before stabilizing again with medication. The doctors wanted to move up the timeline for his surgery if possible, citing concerns that waiting too long could increase the risks involved. The nurse explained, gently but clearly, that the hospital would need confirmation of payment arrangements before scheduling could officially proceed. Elena thanked the nurse, her voice steadier than she felt, and ended the call. She sat back down at the table, her tea now cold and forgotten, and allowed herself, for just a moment, to imagine the relief of simply saying yes to the temptation sitting in that envelope. No one would know. She could return to the estate, retrieve the money quietly, and by evening, have already begun making arrangements for Daniel's care. It would feel, in that moment, like the easiest and most obvious choice in the world. But as she sat there, staring at nothing in particular, she thought again of her mother's voice, patient and firm, the way she used to speak whenever Elena or Daniel faced a difficult choice as children. Her mother had always said that character was not tested in easy moments, but in the moments when doing the right thing cost something real. Elena had believed those words her entire life, had tried to live by them, even when it made things harder rather than easier. She wondered now if she was strong enough to hold on to that belief when the stakes had never been higher. She thought of Nathaniel Ashford, a man she barely knew beyond brief exchanges in hallways, and wondered what he would think if he learned that a member of his own staff had considered, even for a moment, taking money that was never meant for her. She did not know much about his personal life, only what the other staff members occasionally mentioned, that he had inherited the estate from his father several years earlier, that he managed various business interests with quiet precision, and that he had a reputation for treating his household staff with fairness. even if he kept a certain distance in his interactions with them. She wondered, too, why such a large sum of money had been left in an unlocked drawer in the first place. It seemed careless for a man known for his precision, and she found herself curious, despite everything else weighing on her mind. Perhaps it had been an oversight during his hurried departure the day before, or perhaps there was some other explanation she could not begin to guess. Either way, it was not her place to question his decisions, only to decide what she herself would do with the opportunity that had been placed, however unintentionally, within her reach. By mid-morning, Elena knew she could not spend the entire day paralyzed by indecision. She dressed for work, her movements slow and deliberate, her mind still turning over every possible outcome. As she prepared to leave for the estate, she glanced once more at the folder of bills on the table, then at the small photograph of her and Daniel pinned to the refrigerator, taken years earlier, during a rare vacation their parents had managed to afford. In the photograph, Daniel was grinning widely, missing one of his front teeth, his arms slung around Elena's shoulders as though she were the safest place in the world. She left the apartment and began the walk toward the bus stop, the weight of the coming day pressing heavily on her shoulders. Somewhere in the back of her mind, a plan was beginning to form, though she had not yet allowed herself to fully accept what it meant. She would return to the estate, she decided. She would face the envelope again, this time not in the shadowed uncertainty of night, but in the clear light of day, and she would make her decision once and for all. As the bus carried her toward the estate, Elena watched the city pass by outside the window, her thoughts a tangled mixture of fear, love, and a quiet, stubborn hope that she could find a way through this impossible situation without losing the parts of herself she valued most. She did not know yet what choice she would ultimately make, but she knew that whatever she decided would shape not only her own future, but the future of everyone she held dear. The estate came into view as the bus rounded the final bend in the road, its tall gates and sprawling grounds as familiar to her now as her own neighborhood. She stepped off the bus and walked toward the entrance, her heart beating steadily despite the storm of emotions still swirling inside her. Whatever happened next, she told herself, she would face it honestly, the same way she had tried to face everything else in her life, since the day she had taken on the responsibility of caring for Daniel, all those years ago. The estate felt different that day, though nothing about it had physically changed. Elena walked through the side entrance she always used, greeted briefly by one of the gardeners trimming the hedges near the walkway, and made her way toward the staff quarters to begin her shift. Mrs. Whitfield was already in the kitchen, going over the day's schedule with two other members of the cleaning staff, and she glanced up when Elena entered, offering a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to her clipboard. Elena moved through her morning tasks with practiced efficiency, dusting the sitting rooms, changing linens in the guest quarters, and helping prepare the dining room for a meal that would not be served that day, since the Duke remained away on his business trip. Her hands worked automatically, but her mind kept drifting back to the study, to that half-open drawer, to the decision she still had not made. Every time she passed near that wing of the house, her chest tightened, and she forced herself to keep walking, to focus on the task in front of her, rather than the temptation that waited just beyond a closed door. By early afternoon, most of her assigned duties for that section of the house were complete, and she found herself standing outside the study once more, a cleaning cart beside her, an excuse ready in case anyone asked why she needed to enter. The door was closed, just as she had left it the night before, and she stood there for a long moment before finally reaching for the handle. Inside, everything looked exactly as it had. The desk sat undisturbed, the drawer slightly ajar, just as she remembered. She closed the study door behind her, more out of instinct than any real plan, and walked slowly toward the desk. Her hand trembled as she reached for the drawer, and when she pulled it open fully, the envelope sat there waiting, untouched, exactly as she had left it. She lifted it out and held it in both hands, feeling the weight of the money inside, the thickness of the stacks pressing against her palms. For a long moment, she simply stood there, staring down at it, letting every argument she had turned over in her mind the night before rise up once again. She thought of Daniel, of the nurse's call that morning, of the surgery that needed to happen soon rather than later. She thought of the eviction notice, of the rent that would come due again in 2 weeks whether she found a solution or not. She thought of Grace, of the quiet sacrifices she had already made for people she loved, sacrifices that had left her own life more fragile than she liked to admit. And then she thought of her mother, of the values she had been raised with, of the quiet dignity her parents had carried even through their hardest years. She thought of the trust Mrs. Whitfield had placed in her over 3 years of employment, the responsibilities she had been given because of that trust, the reputation she had built through nothing more than consistent honesty and hard work. She thought of what it would mean to break that trust now, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to, in a moment of desperation that no one else would ever need to know about. She realized, standing there with the envelope in her hands, that the money itself was not really the question anymore. The real question was who she wanted to be when this moment had passed, when Daniel's surgery was either paid for through some means or delayed further, when the rent was either covered or the eviction became final. Whatever happened with those practical problems, she would still have to live with herself afterward, would still have to look in the mirror each morning and know the truth of what she had done. She thought about how she would explain it to Daniel, if he ever found out. She imagined sitting across from him, trying to justify why she had taken money that belonged to someone else, no matter how desperately they had needed it. She could not imagine finding the words. Daniel had always looked up to her, had always believed in her fundamental honesty, and she could not bear the thought of shattering that belief, even to save his life. It felt, in that moment, like betraying the very reason she had fought so hard to keep him healthy and safe over all these years. What good was saving his body if she broke something essential in herself in the process? Her decision, when it finally came, arrived not as a dramatic realization, but as a quiet, steady certainty that settled over her like a weight lifting, rather than one being added. She would return the money. Not because it was easy, not because the practical problems in her life had suddenly disappeared, but because she could not live with the alternative. She would find another way to help Daniel, another way to manage the rent, even if that path was harder and less certain than the one currently in her hands. She closed the envelope and placed it back exactly where she had found it, sliding the drawer shut with careful precision so that nothing looked disturbed. Her hands were steadier now than they had been the night before, though her heart still ached with the weight of everything she was choosing to walk away from. She stood there for a moment longer, taking a deep breath, before turning and leaving the study, closing the door quietly behind her. The rest of her shift passed in a strange kind of calm, the decision made and settled even as the practical worries of her life remained unresolved. She finished her duties, checked in with Mrs. Whitfield about the following day's schedule, and prepared to leave for the evening, her mind already turning toward what she would need to do next. She would call the hospital in the morning, explain that she needed more time to arrange payment, perhaps ask about any financial assistance programs available for families in situations like hers. She would speak with her landlord as well, see if there was any possibility of an extension, even a short one, while she figured out a longer-term solution. None of these options felt as immediate or complete as the money sitting in that drawer, but they felt honest, and for the first time since the night before, Elena felt a measure of peace settle into her chest, even amid the uncertainty that still lay ahead. As she walked toward the bus stop that evening, the sky beginning to darken with the early arrival of dusk, she allowed herself to think, just briefly, about what kind of person she wanted Daniel to remember if things did not go well with his surgery. She wanted him to remember a sister who had fought for him honestly, who had exhausted every legitimate option before giving up, rather than one who had compromised her values even in the face of his suffering. It was a painful thought, one that brought tears to her eyes as she waited for the bus, but it also felt true in a way that steadied her despite the sadness. That night, back in her small apartment, Elena sat once more at the kitchen table, the folder of bills spread out before her. She began making a list, methodical and determined, of every possible avenue she could pursue. Financial assistance programs through the hospital, community organizations that helped families with medical expenses, a payment plan negotiated directly with the hospital administration, even if it meant years of monthly payments stretching out ahead of her. She would ask Mrs. Whitfield if the estate offered any kind of emergency assistance for long-term staff members, something she had never needed to inquire about before. She worked late into the night, her tea growing cold beside her, her list growing longer with each passing hour. It was not the swift and complete solution that the envelope had offered, but it was something she could stand behind, something built on effort and honesty, rather than a decision she would have had to hide for the rest of her life. When she finally went to bed, well past midnight, she felt exhausted but strangely lighter than she had felt in days, as though setting aside the temptation had freed something inside her that had been weighed down for far too long. She did not know, as she drifted off to sleep, that her quiet visit to the study earlier that day had not gone entirely unnoticed. The estate, for all its grandeur, was equipped with security cameras throughout its many rooms and hallways, a precaution that Nathaniel Ashford had installed several years earlier after a minor theft involving a distant relative visiting the property. Elena had known about the cameras in a general sense, as all staff members did, but had never given them much thought during her years of employment, since her work had always been honest and straightforward, nothing that required concealment or concern. The cameras had captured everything: her hesitant entrance into the study the night before, her trembling hands hovering over the envelope, her eventual departure without taking anything, and then, that afternoon, her return, her careful placement of the envelope back into the drawer exactly as she had found it, her quiet exit from the room without a single word spoken to anyone about what she had done or considered doing. None of this recording would be reviewed that night, since Nathaniel Ashford was still away on his business trip, dealing with matters unrelated to his household staff or the contents of his study. But the footage remained stored on the estate's security system, waiting, patient and unblinking, to reveal everything to him the moment he returned home, and happened to notice that his careless oversight the day before had, in fact, been discovered by someone in his employ. Elena, unaware of any of this, spent the following days focused entirely on her own efforts to solve her family's crisis through legitimate means. She spoke with a financial counselor at the hospital, who explained several assistance programs available for families facing sudden medical expenses, though qualifying for them would take time and careful documentation. She negotiated a tentative payment plan with the hospital's billing department, one that would allow Daniel's surgery to proceed while spreading the cost across several years, provided she could make a modest initial payment within the next 2 weeks. The rent situation proved more difficult. Her landlord, a practical but not unkind man, agreed to a short extension, but made clear that it could not continue indefinitely. Elena began quietly looking into additional part-time work, anything she could manage alongside her full-time position at the estate, though the prospect of adding more hours to her already exhausting schedule left her feeling drained even before she had secured anything. Despite the mounting practical pressures, Elena carried herself through those days with a quiet steadiness that surprised even her. She had made her choice, and though it had not solved her problems in the swift and complete way the envelope might have, it had given her something else entirely, a sense of having remained true to herself, even in the face of overwhelming temptation. She found herself sleeping slightly better, her conscience clear, even as her financial worries remained very much unresolved. She had no way of knowing that her decision, made in the quiet privacy of an empty study with no one watching except a silent camera mounted near the ceiling, was about to set into motion a series of events that would reveal far more about her character than she had ever intended to share with anyone, least of all the man whose fortune she had so carefully, so completely, chosen to return without a single word. Nathaniel Ashford returned to the estate 3 days later than originally planned, his business trip extended by complications, with an overseas contract that had demanded far more of his attention than he had anticipated. He arrived home exhausted, his mind still cluttered with negotiations and figures, eager for nothing more than a quiet evening in his own study before the demands of the household required his attention again. He walked into the study that evening, loosening his tie as he crossed the room toward his desk and pulled open the drawer where he had, in his hurried departure days earlier, carelessly left an envelope containing funds meant for a private transaction he had been arranging with a business associate. He had not thought much about it since leaving, assuming it would remain undisturbed until his return, as such things always had in his experience. When he saw the envelope sitting exactly where he had left it, he felt only mild relief, a brief confirmation that nothing had gone wrong in his absence. But something made him pause. He lifted the envelope and examined it more closely, noticing that the torn corner he remembered looked slightly different, as though it had been handled and then carefully repositioned. He could not say exactly what drew his attention to it, some small instinct honed by years of managing careful business dealings. But he found himself curious enough to check the contents, counting through the bills methodically. Everything was there, every single bill, exactly as he had left it, not a single note missing from the total. He sat back in his chair, genuinely puzzled. It was not unusual for household staff to encounter money left carelessly around the estate, and in his experience, most people, when faced with such an opportunity, would at least be tempted to take a portion, assuming it would go unnoticed among such a large sum. Yet here it was, complete and untouched, sitting exactly where he had left it. He thought about calling for Mrs. Whitfield, the head housekeeper, to ask if anyone had entered his study during his absence, but something held him back. Instead, he turned to the small monitor built into a discreet panel near his desk, one that allowed him to review security footage from various points around the estate without needing to summon technical staff. He rarely used this feature, considering it more of a formality than a necessity, but tonight his curiosity outweighed his usual disinterest in such matters. He scrolled back through the recorded footage from the study camera, watching the silent, time-stamped recordings move backward through the days he had been away. He found what he was looking for eventually, footage from the night of his departure, showing a young woman entering the room, clearly there for some other purpose given the coffee cup she carried, before pausing at his desk and noticing the open drawer. He watched, increasingly intrigued, as the woman on the screen hesitated, her body language betraying obvious internal conflict. She reached for the envelope, examined it, and then, after a long moment of visible struggle, set it back down and left the room without taking anything. He recognized her immediately as one of his household staff, though he could not recall her name with certainty, only that she had been employed at the estate for some years and had never given him any reason for concern or particular attention. He continued watching, curious now to see if there was more to the story, and found the second piece of footage from the following afternoon. This time, the same young woman entered the study with clear purpose, closed the door behind her, and retrieved the envelope from her coat pocket, exactly where she must have carried it after taking it home the night before, though the footage from her apartment obviously did not exist for him to confirm this assumption. She placed the envelope back into the drawer with careful precision, ensuring it looked undisturbed, before quietly leaving the room once more. Nathaniel sat back in his chair, genuinely astonished by what he had just witnessed. He had encountered many people throughout his years managing the estate and various business interests, and he had grown accustomed to a certain baseline of self-interest in most interactions, even among those he trusted. Rarely had he seen such a clear demonstration of integrity, especially when the temptation involved such a significant sum of money, and such an obvious opportunity to take it without detection. He found himself replaying the footage a second time, studying the woman's expression more carefully, noting the visible distress in her posture, the way her hands trembled as she held the envelope, the long pause before she finally set it back down. This was not someone acting out of indifference toward the money, someone for whom such an amount meant little. This was someone clearly struggling, clearly tempted, who had chosen honesty despite what appeared to be genuine and significant need. He called for Mrs. Whitfield, who arrived within minutes, her expression professionally neutral, as she waited to hear what her employer required. Nathaniel asked her, as casually as he could manage, about the identity of the young woman shown in a still image he had captured from the footage. Mrs. Whitfield studied the image for a moment before confirming that it was Elena Marsh, one of the longest-serving members of the cleaning staff, someone she described, without hesitation, as one of the most trustworthy and hard-working employees on the entire estate. Nathaniel considered how much to share with Mrs. Whitfield about what he had discovered, ultimately deciding to keep the details vague for the moment, simply thanking her for the information and asking a few general questions about Elena's history with the household. Mrs. Whitfield spoke warmly of her, mentioning her reliability, her quiet dedication, and the genuine care she showed toward her work, though she offered little about Elena's personal life beyond acknowledging that she had a younger brother she cared for, having lost both parents at a young age. After Mrs. Whitfield left the study, Nathaniel sat alone for a long while, turning over what he had learned. He found himself unable to simply move past the incident, unable to file it away as a minor curiosity, and return to the many pressing matters that awaited his attention following his trip. Something about what he had witnessed on that footage stayed with him, nagging at his thoughts throughout the rest of the evening and into the following days. He began to wonder, with growing curiosity, why a woman clearly struggling enough to consider taking such a sum of money would ultimately choose to return it without a word, without even leaving a note to explain herself in case she had been discovered. There was something almost noble about the silence of her choice. The fact that she had not sought any acknowledgement or credit for her honesty, had simply done what she believed was right, and then continued with her life, as though nothing significant had happened at all. Over the following days, Nathaniel found himself observing Elena more closely during his interactions with the household staff, though he made a deliberate effort not to draw attention to this unusual interest. He noticed things he had never particularly registered before: the careful precision with which she completed her tasks, the quiet way she interacted with other staff members, always polite but rarely drawing attention to herself. She seemed, in many ways, exactly the kind of person Mrs. Whitfield had described: dedicated and dependable, someone who simply did her work, without seeking recognition. He also began to notice small signs of the struggles she must be facing, details he had never bothered to observe before, but now found himself unable to ignore. Her uniform, though always clean and neatly pressed, showed signs of wear that suggested she could not easily afford replacements. She occasionally seemed tired, in a way that went beyond the normal exhaustion of physical labor, her eyes carrying a weariness that spoke of worries extending far beyond the walls of the estate. He noticed, too, that she rarely took the small breaks other staff members enjoyed throughout the day, seemingly always finding another task to complete, rather than allowing herself a moment of rest. Nathaniel found himself increasingly curious about the full picture of Elena's life, the circumstances that had led her to the edge of such a difficult decision, and the strength of character that had ultimately guided her back from it. He considered simply asking her directly, calling her into his study and inquiring about what he had seen on the footage. But something about that approach felt wrong to him. Too direct, too likely to embarrass her, or make her feel as though she were being interrogated for a choice that had, in the end, reflected only credit upon her character. Instead, he decided to learn more quietly, through more indirect means, hoping to understand the full context of her situation, before deciding how, or if, to address what he had discovered. He began by reviewing her employment records, finding a straightforward history of consistent, positive performance reviews throughout her 3 years with the estate, with no incidents of concern noted anywhere in her file. Her starting position had been temporary, brought on during a particularly busy season, but she had quickly proven herself reliable enough to be offered a permanent role within just a few months. He found himself thinking about her situation even during moments when his attention should have been focused elsewhere, during business calls and meetings that required his full concentration. There was something about the quiet dignity of her choice that lingered with him, a reminder of values he sometimes felt had grown rare in the circles he typically moved through, circles filled with people who measured worth, primarily through wealth and influence rather than character and integrity. He decided, after several days of quiet observation, that he needed to understand more fully what circumstances had brought Elena to that moment of temptation in his study, not out of any intention to judge or punish her, but out of a genuine desire to understand and, if possible, to help. He began making careful, discreet inquiries, being cautious not to reveal the true reason behind his sudden interest in one particular member of his household staff. What he would eventually learn, through a combination of these careful inquiries and one especially revealing conversation with Mrs. Whitfield, would deepen his respect for Elena Marsh, far beyond what the security footage alone had shown him, revealing a pattern of quiet sacrifice and selflessness that extended well beyond that single night in his study, stretching back months into a story of hidden generosity that Elena herself had never intended anyone to discover. Nathaniel began his search for answers the way he approached most complicated matters in his life, methodically, and with careful attention to detail. He knew he could not simply ask Elena directly about her personal circumstances without revealing that he had watched the security footage, and he was not yet ready to have that conversation, uncertain of how she would react to learning that her private moment of struggle had been witnessed and recorded. Instead, he decided to gather information gradually, piecing together a fuller picture before deciding how to proceed. He started by reviewing the payroll records for the estate staff, curious about Elena's exact earnings and how they might compare to the financial pressures Mrs. Whitfield had mentioned in passing. What he found gave him a clearer sense of just how tightly she must be managing her finances. Her wages, while fair by industry standards, were modest, the kind of income that could support a single person comfortably, but would leave little room for unexpected expenses, let alone significant medical costs. He also noticed something unusual buried within the payroll documentation, a recurring pattern of Elena requesting portions of her wages to be transferred directly to another account, rather than deposited into her own, a practice that had begun several months earlier and continued consistently since. The transfers were not large individually, but they added up steadily over time, representing a meaningful portion of her income, redirected elsewhere, for reasons the payroll records did not explain. Curious about this discovery, Nathaniel found himself in a longer conversation with Mrs. Whitfield a few days later, carefully steering the discussion toward the general well-being of the household staff, before eventually mentioning Elena by name again, framing his questions as part of a broader review of employee welfare he claimed to be conducting. Mrs. Whitfield, unaware of his true motivations, spoke freely, clearly fond of Elena and eager to share what she knew. It was through this conversation that Nathaniel first learned the full extent of Daniel's illness, the years of careful management that had kept his condition stable until recently, and the urgent surgery now required to prevent further deterioration. Mrs. Whitfield spoke with genuine concern, mentioning that Elena had seemed increasingly stressed over the past few weeks, though she had never openly discussed the details of her financial struggles with anyone on the staff, preferring instead to handle her difficulties privately, as she always had. Nathaniel asked, as casually as he could manage, whether Mrs. Whitfield knew anything about the wage transfers he had noticed in the payroll records. Mrs. Whitfield's expression shifted slightly, thoughtful and a little surprised, before she mentioned that she believed it had something to do with Grace, the young kitchen assistant who had experienced a family emergency several months earlier. She explained, piecing together fragments of conversations she had overheard, or been told in passing, that Grace's sister had lost her home in a fire, and that Elena had quietly stepped in to help, though Mrs. Whitfield admitted she did not know the full details, since Elena had never openly discussed the arrangement with her directly. This revelation struck Nathaniel with unexpected force. He had already been impressed by Elena's choice to return the money from his study, but learning that she had also been quietly sacrificing a portion of her own limited income for months, in order to help a coworker's family recover from disaster, added an entirely new dimension to his understanding of her character. This was not a single moment of integrity under pressure, easily explained as an isolated act of conscience. This was a consistent pattern of selflessness, extended even when it clearly strained her own already difficult circumstances. Nathaniel decided he needed to speak with Grace directly, hoping to gain a fuller picture of the situation, without yet revealing his knowledge to Elena herself. He arranged, through Mrs. Whitfield, a private conversation with Grace, under the pretense of reviewing kitchen staff performance, a common enough practice that raised no particular suspicion. When Grace arrived for the meeting, she seemed nervous, clearly unaccustomed to direct conversations with her employer, but Nathaniel worked to put her at ease, keeping his tone warm and unhurried. He asked general questions about her role in the kitchens, before gently steering the conversation toward her family, mentioning that he had heard she experienced some difficulties recently, and wanted to ensure the estate had done what it could to support her during that time. Grace's eyes filled with unexpected emotion as she began to explain, haltingly at first, the fire that had destroyed her sister's home, the terrifying weeks that followed as her sister and two young children struggled to find stable housing, and the overwhelming financial burden that had threatened to crush the entire family before help arrived from an unexpected source. She spoke of Elena with clear reverence, describing how her friend had come to her one evening, not with grand promises or dramatic gestures, but simply offering a portion of her own wages each month, insisting quietly that family helped family, even when the family in question was not related by blood, but by the bonds of friendship and shared hardship. Grace explained that she had initially refused, aware of Elena's own struggles caring for her brother, but Elena had been firm, insisting that Grace's sister needed help more urgently in that moment, and that they would find a way to manage. Grace admitted, her voice thick with emotion, that she had never fully understood how much this sacrifice had cost Elena personally, until recent weeks, when she had noticed her friend growing increasingly stressed and withdrawn, though Elena had never once complained or suggested regret about her decision to help. Grace explained that she had recently begun repaying a small portion of what Elena had given, now that her sister's situation had stabilized somewhat, but the majority of the burden had fallen on Elena during the months when help was needed most urgently. Nathaniel listened to this account with a growing sense of quiet astonishment, understanding now the full weight of what Elena had been carrying, not just the pressure of her brother's illness and the temptation of the money in his study, but months of financial strain accepted willingly in order to help someone else through their own crisis. He thanked Grace for her openness, careful to reassure her that nothing she had shared would create any difficulty for either herself or Elena, and that his questions came purely from a place of concern for his staff's well-being. After Grace left his study, Nathaniel sat alone for a long while, processing everything he had learned. He thought about the many people he had encountered throughout his life who possessed far greater wealth than Elena Marsh, people who nonetheless guarded their resources jealously, unwilling to sacrifice even modest comfort for the benefit of others. He thought about the business world he moved through daily, filled with careful calculations of self-interest, negotiations designed to extract maximum advantage regardless of the cost to others involved. Elena's example stood in stark contrast to all of this, a quiet demonstration of values he found himself admiring more with each new detail he uncovered. She had sacrificed her own financial stability to help a friend in crisis, had faced genuine temptation when a fortune sat within easy reach during her own family's most desperate hour, and had chosen honesty and integrity over immediate relief, all without ever seeking recognition or acknowledgement for any of it. He began to feel a growing sense of responsibility, a recognition that someone who had demonstrated such consistent character deserved more than simple admiration from a distance. He thought about the resources at his disposal, resources that could ease Elena's burdens significantly, without requiring any sacrifice on her part, unlike the sacrifices she had made for others. But he also understood, even in these early stages of consideration, that any offer of help needed to be handled with tremendous care, in a way that honored her dignity rather than diminishing it through simple charity. He spent the following days continuing his careful observation, watching Elena move through her daily responsibilities with the same quiet dedication he had always vaguely noticed, but never truly appreciated, until now. He noticed the slight tremor in her hands when she thought no one was watching, the way she sometimes paused near a window, staring out with an expression of exhaustion she quickly hid whenever anyone approached. He noticed too the genuine warmth she showed toward other staff members, the small kindnesses she offered without hesitation, checking in on an elderly gardener during particularly hot afternoons, helping a newer kitchen assistant navigate the complicated demands of a formal dinner service. Nathaniel found himself reflecting more deeply than he had in years about the nature of wealth and privilege, about the responsibility that came with resources far exceeding his personal needs, and about the kind of legacy he wanted to build through the way he used those resources. His own father, who had managed the estate before him, had often spoken about the responsibilities that came with their family's position, though those lessons had sometimes felt abstract to Nathaniel during the busy years of taking over the family business and managing its many complicated interests. Watching Elena's quiet integrity, learning of her sacrifices for both her brother and for Grace's family, brought those lessons into sharper focus than they had ever felt before. He began to understand, in a way that felt suddenly urgent and personal, exactly what his father had meant all those years ago, about using privilege, not as a shield from the struggles of others, but as a tool to genuinely help when help was needed and deserved. He decided, after days of careful consideration, that he could not simply continue observing from a distance. The time had come to approach Elena directly, though he remained uncertain about exactly how to begin such a conversation without causing her discomfort or embarrassment. He thought carefully about his approach, wanting to ensure that whatever he ultimately offered would feel like genuine recognition of her character rather than an uncomfortable act of pity that might make her feel exposed or judged for circumstances entirely beyond her control. As he prepared for this eventual conversation, gathering his thoughts and considering the best way forward, Nathaniel found himself genuinely nervous, in a way that surprised him, accustomed as he was to confident negotiations and important business decisions. Something about this particular situation felt different, more personal and significant than the usual demands of managing his estate and business interests. He understood, on some level he had not yet fully articulated even to himself, that this conversation with Elena Marsh had the potential to change not just her circumstances, but something meaningful within his own understanding of what truly mattered in life. 3 days after his conversation with Grace, Nathaniel found himself standing outside the hospital where Daniel Marsh was being treated, having decided, almost on impulse, that he needed to understand the full reality of the situation before approaching Elena. He had told his driver to wait outside, choosing to enter alone and unannounced, dressed in simple clothing that gave no indication of his usual position or wealth. He did not fully know what he hoped to accomplish by visiting, only that the abstract details he had gathered through payroll records and second-hand conversations felt insufficient compared to seeing the situation firsthand. He approached the reception desk and explained, somewhat vaguely, that he was inquiring on behalf of a family friend about the general costs and requirements for a cardiac surgery, similar to the one Daniel needed, careful not to reveal his true connection to the situation. The hospital administrator he spoke with was patient and thorough, walking him through the typical expenses involved, the payment plans available, and the financial assistance programs that existed for families facing overwhelming medical costs. As he listened, Nathaniel began to understand more clearly just how significant the burden was that Elena had been carrying. The total cost of Daniel's surgery, including the specialist care required both before and after the procedure, extended well beyond what most families could reasonably manage without significant external support. Even with financial assistance programs and payment plans, the administrator explained, families often struggled for years afterward to fully settle the resulting debt, the initial crisis merely the beginning of a much longer financial recovery. Nathaniel asked, carefully phrasing his question to avoid revealing too much, whether the hospital had any patients currently facing urgent timelines who might benefit from immediate and complete payment of their outstanding balance. The administrator, slightly puzzled by the question but professional in her response, mentioned that timely payment could indeed accelerate a patient's surgical scheduling in some cases, particularly when the delay was caused specifically by financial arrangements rather than medical necessity. He thanked her for her time and left the hospital with a clearer understanding of the stakes involved, understanding now with certainty that Daniel's surgery, if delayed much longer, while Elena struggled to arrange partial payments and assistance programs, could result in exactly the kind of deteriorating condition that made such procedures more dangerous and less likely to succeed fully. The urgency of the situation weighed on him heavily as he returned to his car and made his way back to the estate. That evening, back in his study, the same room where this entire situation had begun, Nathaniel sat considering his options carefully. He knew he possessed more than enough resources to resolve Elena's financial crisis entirely, to ensure Daniel received his surgery without delay, to settle the rent situation that Mrs. Whitfield had also mentioned in passing during one of their conversations, having heard rumors among the staff about Elena's housing difficulties. He could solve every practical problem Elena faced with barely a thought to his own finances, a reality that struck him as both a privilege and, in this particular case, a genuine responsibility. But he also understood, with a clarity that had grown stronger throughout his days of careful observation, that simply handing Elena a sum of money, however generously intended, risked undermining exactly the qualities that had drawn his admiration in the first place. Elena had demonstrated, through her actions both in his study and through her quiet sacrifices for Grace's family, a fierce commitment to earning her way honestly, to helping others without seeking recognition, to maintaining her dignity even in the face of desperate circumstances. A sudden, unexplained gift of money, offered without context or genuine connection, might feel to her less like recognition of her character and more like an uncomfortable act of charity that diminished rather than honored what she had accomplished. He thought carefully about how to structure any assistance he might offer, wanting to find an approach that felt earned rather than given, that honored Elena's evident pride and self-reliance, while still providing the practical support her family so urgently needed. He considered various possibilities throughout that evening, discarding several ideas that felt too transactional or impersonal, before finally settling on an approach that felt more appropriate to the situation. He decided he would speak with Elena directly, honestly explaining what he had discovered through the security footage and his subsequent inquiries, rather than attempting to hide his knowledge or approach the situation indirectly. He believed she deserved that honesty, deserved to know clearly why he was choosing to intervene in her circumstances, rather than being left wondering about the true motivations behind any assistance she might receive. He also decided that whatever support he offered would be framed not as charity, but as genuine recognition of her exceptional character and the quiet sacrifices she had made, both for her own family and for others within his household staff. The following morning, Nathaniel asked Mrs. Whitfield to arrange a private meeting with Elena, careful to keep his request casual enough not to raise undue alarm among the staff, though he understood that any unusual summons to speak privately with the estate owner would likely generate some curiosity and concern regardless of how he framed it. Mrs. Whitfield agreed to arrange the meeting for that afternoon, mentioning that Elena had a short break scheduled between her usual duties. Elena, when informed of the unexpected request, felt her stomach tighten with immediate anxiety. In 3 years of employment, she had never once been summoned for a private conversation with Nathaniel Ashford, their interactions always limited to brief, professional exchanges in passing. Her mind raced through possible explanations, wondering if perhaps her performance had been called into question, or worse, if somehow her actions in the study weeks earlier had been discovered despite her careful efforts to leave no trace of what had happened. She spent the hours leading up to the meeting in a state of quiet dread, her hands trembling slightly as she completed her morning tasks, her mind unable to focus fully on anything beyond the impending conversation. She considered, briefly, whether she should preemptively explain herself, offer some kind of confession, before Nathaniel could raise whatever concern had prompted this unusual meeting. But she decided against it, reasoning that she had done nothing wrong, that whatever had happened in that study weeks earlier had ended with her choosing honesty over temptation, and that she had no reason to feel guilty about a decision that reflected only credit upon her character, even if the initial moment of hesitation had been real and difficult. When the appointed time arrived, Elena made her way toward Nathaniel's study, her footsteps echoing slightly in the quiet hallway, her heart pounding with an intensity that reminded her uncomfortably of that first night when she had discovered the envelope in his desk drawer. She paused outside the door, taking a steadying breath before knocking gently, waiting for his response before entering. Nathaniel looked up from his desk as she entered, offering a warm but slightly nervous smile that surprised Elena, given her expectation of a stern or formal demeanor, befitting such an unusual meeting. He gestured toward a chair across from his desk, inviting her to sit, though Elena remained standing for a moment longer, uncertain and cautious, before finally accepting the offered seat, her posture rigid with tension. Nathaniel began carefully, thanking her for taking the time to meet with him, acknowledging that he understood this was an unusual request that had likely caused her some concern. He watched her closely as he spoke, noticing the way her hands gripped the edge of the chair, the careful neutrality she maintained in her expression despite what he suspected was significant anxiety beneath the surface. He decided, in that moment, that further delay would only prolong her discomfort unnecessarily, and that the honest approach he had planned was indeed the right one. He explained, gently but directly, that he had reviewed the security footage from his study, following his return from his business trip, footage that had shown her presence in the room on 2 separate occasions weeks earlier. He watched her face carefully as he spoke, seeing the color drain slightly from her cheeks, her eyes widening with a mixture of surprise and something that looked distinctly like fear. He quickly reassured her, his tone gentle and sincere, that he had not called her into this meeting to express any concern or displeasure about what he had witnessed. Quite the opposite, he explained. He had been genuinely moved by what he had seen, by her clear internal struggle and her ultimate decision to return money that had, through his own carelessness, been left in a position that made it easy for her to take, without any risk of discovery. He told her plainly that he understood, based on subsequent conversations with Mrs. Whitfield and with Grace, something of the difficult circumstances she had been facing, both regarding her brother's medical needs and her own generous, quiet sacrifice on behalf of a co-worker's family in crisis. Elena sat in stunned silence as Nathaniel spoke, her mind struggling to process the fact that her most private struggle, the moment she had believed entirely her own, hidden from everyone around her, had in fact been witnessed and understood by the very man whose fortune she had considered taking. Shame and embarrassment flooded through her, followed quickly by a fierce protective instinct that made her want to explain herself, to justify the moment of weakness that had led her to even consider taking money that was never hers. Before she could gather her thoughts enough to respond, Nathaniel continued, his voice steady and sincere, explaining that he had no interest in making her feel ashamed or exposed by what he had learned. Rather, he wanted her to understand that he recognized, clearly and completely, the strength of character required to make the choice she had made, especially given the desperate circumstances surrounding her brother's illness. He told her that such integrity, demonstrated consistently, rather than as an isolated incident, deserved acknowledgement, rather than silence, and that he intended to offer her real, meaningful support, not as an act of pity, but as genuine recognition of the values she had shown throughout her time at the estate. Elena, still reeling from the revelation that her private struggle had been observed, found herself torn between gratitude for his understanding and a fierce discomfort at the idea of accepting help that felt uncomfortably close to charity. She had spent her entire adult life fighting to remain self-reliant, to earn everything through her own efforts, rather than depending on the generosity of others, and the prospect of accepting significant assistance from her employer, however kindly intended, sat uneasily with the pride she had cultivated through years of difficult, independent struggle. She began, hesitantly at first, to explain this discomfort to Nathaniel, her voice growing steadier, as she found the words to articulate feelings she had never before needed to express so directly. She told him that while she appreciated his understanding and his evident sincerity, she could not simply accept a handout, however generously offered, without feeling as though she were compromising the very principles that had guided her decision to return his money in the first place. She explained that her dignity, her sense of having earned her own way through honest effort, mattered to her as much as any practical solution to her family's financial crisis. Nathaniel listened carefully to her explanation, nodding slowly as she spoke, clearly taking her words seriously, rather than dismissing them as mere pride standing in the way of a simple solution. He acknowledged that he understood her hesitation, that he had anticipated exactly this kind of resistance from someone who had already demonstrated such a strong commitment to earning her own way, rather than depending on others. He assured her that he had no intention of simply handing her money without context or purpose, but rather wanted to find a way forward that honored both her practical needs and her evident values. The conversation that followed stretched on far longer than either of them had initially anticipated, moving gradually from tension and uncertainty towards something more open and genuine, as Nathaniel and Elena worked together to find an approach that felt right to both of them. One that would address the urgent practical realities of Daniel's medical needs and the family's housing situation, while still respecting the fierce independence and integrity that had defined Elena's approach to her own life throughout every difficult circumstance she had faced. As the afternoon light shifted through the tall windows of the study, casting long shadows across the polished wooden floor, Elena found herself speaking more openly than she had intended, the careful walls she usually maintained around her private struggles slowly beginning to lower. She told Nathaniel about her parents, about the sudden losses that had reshaped her entire life at 19, about the years of working multiple jobs to keep herself and Daniel afloat while still finishing her own education in whatever spare hours she could find. She spoke of Daniel's illness with a tenderness that revealed just how deeply she loved her brother, describing the years of careful management, the small victories and frightening setbacks that had marked his condition since it was first diagnosed. She explained, her voice occasionally wavering with emotion she usually kept carefully controlled, how frightening it had been to watch his condition worsen recently, how helpless she had felt knowing that a solution existed but remained financially out of reach. Nathaniel listened without interrupting, giving her the space to share as much or as little as she felt comfortable revealing, understanding instinctively that this kind of trust could not be rushed or forced. When she finally paused, having shared more than she had ever told anyone outside her closest circle of friends, he responded not with sympathy that felt performative or hollow, but with genuine reflection, sharing something of his own family history that he rarely discussed with anyone. He told her about his father, a man who had built much of the family's current business success, but who had also, in his final years, expressed regret about opportunities missed to use their considerable resources for more meaningful purposes, beyond simple accumulation of wealth. He explained that his father had often spoken about the responsibility that came with privilege, lessons that had felt somewhat abstract to Nathaniel during his younger years, but that had grown increasingly significant since he had taken over management of the estate and its various business interests. He admitted, with a candor that surprised even himself, that witnessing Elena's choice in his study, and learning subsequently of her quiet sacrifices for Grace's family, had affected him more deeply than he had initially expected. It had reminded him, he explained, of exactly the kind of character his father had always hoped to see more of in the world, a commitment to doing what was right, even when no one was watching, even when the personal cost was significant. This exchange of honesty, unexpected and unplanned, gradually shifted the tone of their conversation from one of careful negotiation toward something warmer and more genuine. Elena found herself, somewhat to her own surprise, beginning to trust that Nathaniel's intentions were exactly as sincere as he claimed, that his interest in helping her family stemmed not from pity or a desire to exercise power over someone in a vulnerable position, but from authentic respect for the choices she had made. Together, they began working through practical possibilities that might address her family's needs, while still preserving the sense of earned dignity that mattered so deeply to her. Nathaniel proposed, after much discussion, an arrangement that framed itself not as charity, but as a formal recognition of Elena's exceptional service and character. Structured similarly to programs he explained existed within many well-managed organizations for employees facing extraordinary circumstances, he suggested establishing an emergency assistance fund through the estate, one that would cover the immediate costs of Daniel's surgery, as an advance against future benefits Elena would earn through continued dedicated service, structured in a way that felt more like an investment in a valued employee than a handout offered out of pity. Elena considered this proposal carefully, appreciating the thoughtfulness behind its framing, even as she recognized that the practical effect remained essentially the same as accepting significant financial help. But something about the language Nathaniel used, the genuine respect evident in how he presented the idea, made it feel different from what she had initially feared when he first mentioned wanting to offer assistance. This felt less like an act of pity, and more like acknowledgement of value she had already demonstrated through years of reliable, honest service to the estate. She asked careful questions about the terms of such an arrangement, wanting to understand exactly what would be expected of her in return, unwilling to accept help that came with hidden obligations or expectations she might struggle to meet. Nathaniel answered each question thoughtfully, making clear that the arrangement carried no unusual expectations beyond the same dedicated service she had already been providing, and that repayment, if it occurred at all, would happen gradually and without pressure, structured entirely around her own financial recovery, rather than any rigid timeline that might add additional stress to her already difficult circumstances. As they continued discussing the details, Elena found herself gradually relaxing, the tension that had gripped her since entering the study slowly easing as she recognized the genuine care behind Nathaniel's proposal. She mentioned, somewhat hesitantly, her concerns about the rent situation as well, admitting that the medical costs, while urgent, were not the only financial pressure weighing on her family in that moment. Nathaniel listened carefully, immediately including this concern within the broader assistance package they were discussing, ensuring that Elena would not need to worry about losing her home, while also managing her brother's medical care. Throughout their conversation, Nathaniel found himself increasingly drawn to Elena's thoughtful, careful approach to every aspect of their discussion, her evident intelligence and emotional depth becoming more apparent the longer they spoke. He noticed the way she considered each point carefully before responding, the genuine gratitude she expressed, without ever appearing overly eager or desperate, maintaining throughout their conversation the same quiet dignity that had first captured his attention through the security footage weeks earlier. Elena, for her part, found herself surprised by how easy Nathaniel was to talk with once the initial tension of the conversation had passed, his careful attentiveness and genuine warmth contrasting sharply with the more distant, formal impression she had always held of him based on their limited previous interactions. She began to understand, through this extended conversation, that the reputation he carried among the staff, fair but reserved, had perhaps obscured a deeper thoughtfulness that simply required the right circumstances to reveal itself. As their meeting drew toward its natural conclusion, Nathaniel proposed that he personally contact the hospital administration the following morning to arrange immediate payment for Daniel's surgery, ensuring the procedure could be scheduled as quickly as medically appropriate, rather than waiting for the slower process of assistance program approvals and payment plan negotiations that Elena had been navigating on her own. He also mentioned he would speak with his own financial advisor about the specific structure of the emergency assistance arrangement, promising to have clear documentation ready for Elena to review within a few days, ensuring she would have complete transparency about the terms before anything moved forward. Elena thanked him, her voice thick with an emotion she struggled to fully articulate, gratitude mixed with a lingering disbelief that her circumstances, which had felt so overwhelming and hopeless just days earlier, might genuinely be resolving through this unexpected turn of events. She found herself, as she prepared to leave the study and return to her regular duties, feeling a complicated mixture of relief and continued uncertainty. aware that accepting this help represented a significant shift in her relationship with her employer, one whose full implications she had not yet had time to fully consider. Before she left, Nathaniel added one more thought, speaking with evident sincerity as he looked directly at her. He told her that regardless of how she ultimately decided to proceed with the specific arrangement they had discussed, he wanted her to know that his admiration for her character remained unaffected by whether she accepted his help or not. He explained that witnessing her integrity, both in that study weeks earlier and through her ongoing sacrifices for Grace's family, had genuinely changed something in how he viewed the responsibilities that came with his own position and resources. Elena left the study that afternoon with her mind spinning. The weight of weeks of anxiety and desperate calculation suddenly, unexpectedly lifted in ways she had not dared to hope for just days earlier. She walked through the familiar hallways of the estate, feeling as though she were seeing them slightly differently, the same rooms and corridors now carrying new significance given everything that had just transpired within that quiet study. That evening, when she returned home and found Daniel awake and alert during her visit to the hospital, she found herself hesitating before explaining what had happened, uncertain how to describe the strange turn her circumstances had taken, without revealing details about the money she had discovered and returned. A secret she still felt reluctant to share, even with her closest family member. She settled instead on explaining simply that her employer had learned of their situation and had offered significant assistance with the medical costs, framing it in terms that felt true, without revealing the full complexity of how this assistance had come to be offered. Daniel, weakened but still sharp-witted despite his illness, studied his sister carefully as she explained this unexpected development, sensing perhaps that there was more to the story than she was sharing, but choosing not to press for details he could see she was not yet ready to provide. He simply reached for her hand, his grip weaker than it used to be, but still carrying the same warmth and trust that had defined their relationship throughout every hardship they had faced together, and thanked her quietly for everything she had done and continued to do to keep him safe and cared for. As Elena sat beside her brother's hospital bed that evening, watching him rest more peacefully than he had in weeks, knowing now that his surgery would soon proceed without the crushing financial uncertainty that had loomed over them for so long, she allowed herself, for the first time in longer than she could remember, to feel genuine hope about their future. Whatever complexities might arise from her new arrangement with Nathaniel Ashford, whatever uncertainties remained about how this unexpected turn of events might reshape her position at the estate, she knew that the most urgent crisis facing her family had finally, through honesty rather than deception, found its way toward resolution. The following weeks unfolded with a swiftness that left Elena occasionally breathless, the practical machinery of Nathaniel's promised assistance moving forward with an efficiency she had never experienced in her own attempts to navigate the hospital's bureaucracy alone. Within days, the hospital confirmed that Daniel's surgery had been scheduled for the following week. The payment arrangements settled completely through Nathaniel's direct intervention with the hospital's administration. The specialist assigned to the procedure, one of the most respected surgeons in the region, personally reviewed Daniel's case and expressed confidence in a successful outcome, given that the surgery would now proceed before his condition had the chance to deteriorate further. Elena visited Daniel frequently during that final week before his surgery, watching him grow increasingly hopeful despite the natural anxiety that came with such a significant procedure. She had finally shared with him, in a quiet conversation one evening, a somewhat abbreviated version of the full story, explaining that she had discovered money left carelessly in her employer's study, had struggled with the temptation to take it given their desperate circumstances, but had ultimately chosen to return it, a decision that had, through unexpected circumstances, led to Nathaniel Ashford learning of their situation and offering to help. Daniel had listened to this account with a mixture of pride and gentle amusement, telling his sister that he was not surprised in the slightest that she had chosen honesty even in such a difficult moment, since it matched exactly the character he had always known her to possess throughout their years together. He teased her gently about the dramatic nature of the story, joking that it sounded like something from one of the romantic novels their mother used to read, though his eyes carried genuine warmth and gratitude beneath the lighthearted teasing. The rent situation resolved itself similarly through Nathaniel's intervention. The overdue balance settled directly with her landlord, along with several months paid in advance to provide Elena with breathing room while she adjusted to her new circumstances. Elena had initially resisted this particular aspect of the assistance, feeling that the housing situation felt somehow more personal than the medical emergency. But Nathaniel had gently insisted that addressing every source of her financial stress would allow her to focus fully on supporting Daniel through his recovery, without the added burden of worrying about losing their home during such a critical time. The formal documentation for the emergency assistance arrangement arrived exactly as Nathaniel had promised, presented to Elena during another private meeting in his study, though this time the atmosphere between them felt notably different from their first difficult conversation weeks earlier. The terms, as outlined in the careful legal language of the document, structured the assistance as Nathaniel had described, a combination of an advance against future benefits and a formal acknowledgement of exceptional service, with repayment terms so generous they felt, to Elena, almost symbolic rather than truly burdensome. She reviewed the document carefully, asking thoughtful questions about several clauses she did not fully understand, and found Nathaniel patient and thorough in his explanations, never showing any impatience with her careful, methodical approach to understanding exactly what she was agreeing to. This careful attention to her concerns, rather than simply expecting her gratitude and quick signature, reinforced the growing trust she felt developing between them, a trust built not on the money itself, but on the evident respect Nathaniel continued to show for her autonomy and her right to fully understand any arrangement affecting her life. The day of Daniel's surgery arrived with a mixture of anxiety and hope that Elena had not experienced in longer than she could remember. She sat in the hospital waiting room throughout the lengthy procedure, her hands clasped tightly together, her mind cycling through every possible outcome despite the surgeon's confident assessment before the operation began. To her genuine surprise, Nathaniel arrived at the hospital partway through the long wait, explaining simply that he had wanted to be present, to offer support during such an important moment, though he made clear he would leave immediately if his presence felt intrusive or unwelcome. Elena, touched by this unexpected gesture, found herself grateful for the company during those anxious hours, the quiet conversation they shared helping to pass the time and ease some of her nervous tension. They spoke of lighter topics during much of the wait, Nathaniel asking about her interests outside of work, discovering that she had once dreamed of studying to become a nurse, before circumstances forced her to prioritize immediate income over long-term education. He listened with genuine interest as she described this abandoned dream, asking thoughtful questions about what had drawn her to that particular calling, and whether she still harbored any hope of pursuing it eventually. When the surgeon finally emerged from the operating room several hours later, his expression calm and reassuring, Elena felt a wave of relief so powerful it brought tears immediately to her eyes. The surgery had proceeded exactly as hoped, the surgeon explained, with every indication that Daniel's recovery would proceed smoothly, given proper rest and follow-up care. Elena thanked the surgeon repeatedly, her voice thick with emotion, before turning to find Nathaniel watching her with an expression of genuine shared relief and happiness that surprised her with its evident sincerity. In the days that followed, as Daniel began his recovery under careful medical supervision, Elena found herself reflecting often on how dramatically her circumstances had shifted in just a few short weeks. The desperate uncertainty that had gripped her life for months, the constant calculation of impossible financial pressures, had given way to a stability she had almost forgotten was possible. She continued her work at the estate throughout this period, though she noticed subtle shifts in how she approached her daily responsibilities, a lightness in her step that had been absent during the darker months preceding Daniel's surgery. Her relationship with Nathaniel continued to evolve during this time as well, their interactions growing gradually more frequent and comfortable, beyond the strict formality that had defined their previous years of employer and employee. He would occasionally seek her out during her breaks, their conversations ranging across various topics, from her observations about managing the household to broader discussions about books they had both read or current events that interested them both. Elena found herself looking forward to these exchanges more than she felt entirely comfortable admitting, even to herself, uncertain about what these growing feelings might mean, given the significant differences in their respective positions and circumstances. Mrs. Whitfield, observant as always, began to notice these subtle shifts as well, though she said nothing directly, choosing instead to offer occasional knowing glances whenever Elena mentioned a conversation with Nathaniel, or when he happened to seek her out during her regular duties. Elena caught these glances and felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment, though she found herself unable to fully deny the growing significance these interactions held in her daily life. Grace, too, noticed the changes in her friend, gently teasing Elena during their shared lunch breaks about the way her expression softened whenever their employer's name came up in conversation. Elena tried to deflect these observations initially, insisting that her relationship with Nathaniel remained purely professional, shaped by the unusual circumstances of his generous assistance rather than anything more personal. But even as she offered these explanations, she found herself increasingly uncertain whether she fully believed them. As weeks turned into months, Daniel continued his recovery successfully, gradually regaining his strength and eventually returning to his own modest apartment, now able to manage his health with far greater confidence given the successful surgery. The formal terms of Elena's assistance arrangement with Nathaniel proceeded exactly as documented, small automatic deductions from her wages representing symbolic rather than truly burdensome repayment, a gesture that preserved her sense of earned dignity, even as the practical crisis that had originally prompted the arrangement had long since resolved. Nathaniel, meanwhile, found himself increasingly drawn into deeper reflection about the values that mattered most in his own life, inspired significantly by his continued observations of Elena's approach to her work, her relationships, and her evident commitment to integrity, even in small, unwitnessed moments. He began implementing broader changes within the estate's management practices, establishing more formal support systems for staff facing unexpected hardships, inspired directly by the lessons he had learned through Elena's story, though he never framed these initiatives publicly as connected to any single individual's circumstances, preferring to honor Elena's evident preference for privacy regarding her own struggles. Their relationship, though it developed gradually and carefully given the inherent complexities of their respective positions, grew steadily warmer and more genuine with each passing month. Nathaniel found himself, more often than he would have anticipated just months earlier, seeking Elena's perspective on various matters, valuing her thoughtful, grounded approach to problems that sometimes felt overly complicated when viewed through the lens of his usual business associates and social circles. Elena, for her part, continued to approach this evolving relationship with the same careful thoughtfulness that had defined every significant decision throughout her life, unwilling to rush toward assumptions about what these growing feelings might ultimately mean, while also increasingly unable to deny that something meaningful had developed between herself and the man whose fortune she had once, in a moment of desperate temptation, considered taking without a word. A year passed, and the estate that had once felt to Elena like a place of quiet service and careful distance had become something closer to a second home, filled now with warmth and genuine connection, rather than the strict formality that had defined her earliest years there. Daniel had continued to thrive following his surgery, his health stable and improving steadily, allowing him to pursue a modest job of his own and begin building a life that no longer revolved entirely around managing his illness. Elena, encouraged gently by Nathaniel, had finally begun pursuing the nursing education she had abandoned years earlier, taking evening classes while continuing her work at the estate, her schedule demanding, but filled with a sense of purpose she had not experienced in longer than she could remember. Nathaniel had insisted on covering the cost of her tuition, framing it once again not as charity, but as an investment in someone whose character and dedication he believed deserved every opportunity to flourish. And Elena, having grown to trust his sincerity fully over the preceding months, had accepted this support with far less hesitation than she might have shown a year earlier. Their relationship had grown, gradually and naturally, into something neither of them had anticipated when Elena first stood trembling before that envelope in his study. What had begun as an employer's curious admiration for an employee's remarkable integrity had deepened, through countless shared conversations and mutual respect, into a genuine partnership built on honesty rather than convenience or circumstance. Nathaniel had proposed marriage that spring, not with grand gestures or public spectacle, but with the same quiet sincerity that had characterized their entire relationship, presenting Elena with a simple ring during a private evening walk through the estate's gardens, asking if she would consider building a future together, one grounded in the same values of honesty and mutual respect that had brought them together in the first place. Elena had said yes, her tears mixing with genuine laughter as she embraced him, both of them fully aware of how unlikely their story might have seemed to anyone hearing it from the outside, a housekeeper and a duke finding their way toward genuine love through a moment of profound temptation and equally profound integrity. Their wedding, held quietly at the estate, with only close friends and family in attendance, felt to both of them like a natural culmination of everything they had built together over the preceding year, a celebration not of wealth or status, but of the shared values that had guided both of them through difficult circumstances towards something genuinely meaningful. Grace stood among the guests that day, tears in her eyes, as she watched her closest friend marry a man who had proven himself worthy of her trust through consistent action, rather than empty promises. Mrs. Whitfield, too, watched with evident pride, having played her own quiet role in bringing Elena and Nathaniel's story to its unexpected conclusion through her honest, caring conversations months earlier. Daniel, fully recovered and thriving, walked his sister down the aisle, his pride in her evident in every step, knowing better than anyone the long, difficult journey that had brought her to this moment of genuine happiness. In the years that followed, Elena completed her nursing education and began working part-time at a local clinic, continuing to draw on her natural compassion and dedication to help others, while also taking on a more active role in managing charitable initiatives at the estate, ensuring that the emergency assistance program Nathaniel had established for staff members continued to grow and evolve, helping others facing their own moments of crisis find support without sacrificing their dignity in the process. Nathaniel, transformed by his growing understanding of what truly mattered beyond wealth and status, continued expanding these charitable efforts throughout the broader community, inspired always by the lesson Elena had taught him through her quiet, unwitnessed choice to return money that could have solved her every problem instantly, choosing instead the harder path of honesty and earned dignity. He often reflected, during quiet moments with his wife, on how differently his life might have unfolded had he never noticed that slightly torn corner of an envelope, had he never paused to review the security footage that revealed the depth of character possessed by the woman who would eventually become his partner, in every meaningful sense of the word. Their story, though never publicized or widely known beyond their closest circle of friends and family, remained for both of them a constant reminder of the values that mattered most, proof that integrity, even when tested in the most desperate of circumstances, could ultimately lead toward outcomes far more meaningful than any immediate solution born from compromise. Elena Marsh, who had once stood trembling before a fortune large enough to solve every problem in her life, had chosen instead the harder path of honesty, and in doing so, had found something far more valuable than money alone could ever have provided. A life built on genuine trust, mutual respect, and a love that had grown from the strongest possible foundation, complete honesty, even when no one else was watching.